At 5 o'clock in the morning, the office was silent in that way. Only people who work before dawn understand. No chatter, no managers, just the hum of servers, the glow of monitors, and the feeling that the rest of the world had forgotten you existed. That was when I closed my laptop. Not angrily, not dramatically, just deliberately, because an hour earlier, they had told me exactly what I was worth. My name is Chase Warren. I'm 46 years old, and until that morning, I worked for Northbridge Risk Systems, a mid-sized financial compliance firm that liked to call itself mission critical. We monitored regulatory exposure, transaction anomalies, and audit risks for regional banks' quiet work, invisible work, the kind where nothing happening meant you were doing everything right. I ran the early morning compliance review cycle, 5 a.m. to 2 p.m. I caught the issues no one else wanted to deal with: the borderline transactions, the gray area flags, the reports that could either save a client millions or start a federal inquiry if handled wrong. On Thursday afternoon, leadership announced retention bonuses. You know the tone. Warm, appreciative, urgent. Disguised as gratitude, key contributors. They said, people we can't afford to lose. They didn't say names. They never do. An hour later, my coworker Evan Mercer messaged me privately. He tried to sound humble, didn't expect this at all. He wrote, then he sent a screenshot. $35,000. Cash, 1-year retention agreement. Evan had been with the company 3 years. Solid guy. But I trained him, corrected his reports, covered for him when he missed things during handoffs. I didn't feel jealous. I felt informed. 20 minutes later, my call came. Human resources. Video on. Smiles practiced. Chase, the HR director said, we truly value your consistency and institutional knowledge. Then she said the number, $5,500, same retention period, same expectations. I waited for her to correct herself. She didn't. That was the moment something settled quietly inside me. Not anger, not shock, but clarity. Because after 22 years in corporate environments, I finally understood the equation. They weren't paying for importance. They were paying for visibility. And at 5 o'clock the next morning, I decided I was done being invisible. How does this moment feel for you right now? Heavy, familiar, or uncomfortably close to home if you can? Take a second to settle into a softer seat or adjust your cushion so you can stay with this story all the way through. Where are you listening from today? If stories like this help you feel less alone in what you've lived through, subscribing is a quiet way to keep walking together, and what comes next is where the calm breaks and the consequences begin. I didn't walk out immediately after that call. I finished my shift, reviewed the last compliance batch, flagged 2 borderline transactions that would have become someone else's problem by mid-morning. Old habits don't disappear just because respect does. But the number stayed with me. 5,500. Same retention agreement as Evans. Same 1-year commitment, same language about critical continuity, different math, very different expectations. That afternoon, I opened the document they'd sent over. 12 months, automatic repayment if I left early, confidentiality clause about compensation, another paragraph quietly reminding me that at-will employment still applied. They wanted my loyalty locked in while keeping their exit wide open. That's when I understood something I'd been ignoring for years. Retention wasn't about keeping people. It was about controlling risk. Evan was visible. He ran presentations, joined meetings, knew how to sound confident in front of directors when things went wrong during business hours. Executives recognized his face on the call. I worked before dawn. I prevented problems from ever becoming conversations. Northbridge didn't reward prevention. They rewarded reassurance. That night, I pulled up my personal spreadsheet, the one with mortgage payments, insurance, my daughter's college fund. I typed in 5,500, then, below it, 35,000, not to compare, just to see it clearly. 2 weeks earlier, Evan had escalated a compliance anomaly without context, nearly triggered a client-side audit. I caught it during my shift, rewrote the analysis, documented the rationale, and saved the account. Leadership never heard about it. They never do. Around midnight, alerts started stacking. A regional bank client had unusual cross-border activity, nothing illegal yet, but close enough to require careful handling. I recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't fraud. It was a system timing issue tied to a recent software update. I fixed it, logged it, closed the case, then my phone buzzed. Evan. Hey, Chase. Seeing flags on the Riverbend account. You good on that? I stared at the message longer than I should have. Normally, I'd walk him through it, explain the nuance, protect him from making noise where silence mattered. That's what I'd always done. Instead, I typed back, resolved, logged in the system. Nothing else? No explanation, no safety net. A minute later, can you hop on a quick call? Leadership's asking questions. I looked at the unsigned retention agreement, looked at the time 4:47 a.m., looked at how tired I suddenly felt. I'm off shift in 13 minutes, I replied. Everything you need is documented. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared at 5 o'clock. I shut my laptop. That wasn't the decision. It was just the first visible consequence. The strange thing wasn't that no one stopped me when I logged off. It was how quickly the quiet settled in afterward. I expected panic, angry messages. A last-minute call asking me to stay on just a few more minutes. That's usually how it goes. Urgency wrapped in politeness once someone realizes they've leaned too hard. Instead, there was nothing. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table while the sun crept up behind the houses across the street. My phone stayed face down, untouched, for the first time in years. I wasn't listening for alerts in the background of my own thoughts. A message finally came through. Not from Evan, from operations. Morning. Chase, can you confirm you're available today if we need clarification on overnight items available? Not responsible, not leading, just available. I didn't answer right away. I opened my work email instead. Overnight tickets had stacked up faster than usual. Riverbend had reopened the same case I'd closed, this time with confusion layered on top of it. Someone had escalated a non-issue into a potential exposure event. Exactly what I'd prevented. Scrolling further, I saw the calendar invite. Urgent alignment compliance coverage, no agenda, leadership-heavy guest list, Evan included, me, optional. That's when it clicked. They weren't worried about the work. They were worried about explaining it. Northbridge had built its entire compliance posture around a quiet assumption that someone like me would always be there to absorb complexity, smooth mistakes, and keep executives insulated from consequences. And now, that assumption was unstable. At 8:15, Evan finally called. Hey, he said, trying for casual and missing by a mile. Quick question. On the Riverbend issue, why did you categorize it as operational variance instead of transactional anomaly? Because that's what it was. Because I've seen it a dozen times. Because I wrote the internal guideline 3 years ago. I answered him anyway. Calm, precise, professional. There was a pause on the line. That's not in the playbook, he said. No, I replied. It's in the documentation. Silence again. The uncomfortable kind. Leadership's asking if you can join the call, he added, just to explain it. I pictured the room conference table, nodding heads, relieved smiles once the scary thing was named and contained, Evan talking afterward like it had been a team effort. I pictured the number again, 5,500. I'm not on retention, I said evenly, and I'm not on call. Another pause, longer this time. Chase, he said quietly, we really need you today. That was the moment the weight lifted. I know, I said. That's the problem. I ended the call and set the phone down. By mid-morning, the status board had shifted from green to yellow, not because anything was broken, but because no one knew how to say, with confidence, that it wasn't, and uncertainty spreads faster than any real risk ever does. Most people stop here, but the truth lies in the next part. Yellow never feels urgent at first. That's what makes it dangerous. Red means something is broken. Red comes with alarms, clear responsibility, and visible action. Yellow is quieter. It spreads through hesitation, through half-finished sentences and carefully worded messages that don't quite say anything at all. I watched it happen without touching a thing. Slack channels lit up in short bursts, people repeating the same facts in slightly different ways, hoping clarity would appear if they circled it long enough. Someone asked whether Riverbend needed a formal memo. Someone else asked who should sign it. No one answered directly. Confidence had slipped, and once that happens in a regulated environment, everything slows down. A message came in from operations, polite and cautious. Leadership would really appreciate your input. Even a few bullet points would help. I read it, then closed the app. For years, I would have responded automatically, explained the nuance, framed the issue in language executives liked, Protected the system by protecting the people who didn't fully understand it. This time, I didn't. I stepped outside instead. Same quiet street, same familiar houses. Nothing out there reflected the tension building inside the company, and that contrast made everything clearer. The problem wasn't the work. It never had been. When I came back, my phone was heavier than before. Missed calls, voicemails, names I rarely saw outside of escalations. I listened to one. "Hey, Chase," Evan said, voice tight. "They're asking why this wasn't handled differently. I'm having trouble explaining the rationale." That sentence mattered. He didn't say fixed. He didn't say resolved. He said explaining. They weren't afraid of the issue. They were afraid of not being able to justify it. I replied by email, keeping my tone clean and professional. "I'm happy to provide clarification once my role and compensation are formally aligned with the expectations being placed on it. Until then, the documentation attached to the case file should be sufficient. No anger, no threat, just a line drawn exactly where it belonged." The response chain grew quickly after that. Human resources joined, then finance, then legal. Copied quietly at the end, the conversation shifted without anyone announcing it. Riverbend faded into the background, replaced by questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Why does one person carry this much context? Why isn't this knowledge distributed? Who decided which roles were critical, and how was that measured? Those questions don't stay small. Someone used the phrase process review. Someone else said coverage risk. And just like that, the issue was no longer technical. It was structural. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady for the first time. The system was reacting to the absence I'd always quietly filled, and the realization was beginning to spread. This wasn't about someone leaving. It was about what they'd been leaning on without admitting it. The review didn't begin with blame. It never does. It started with phrases like knowledge transfer and operational resilience, neutral words, designed to sound responsible instead of reactive. Leadership wanted to believe this was a documentation problem, something that could be solved with a few meetings in a shared folder. That belief didn't last long. Requests came in quietly at first. Someone asked where a particular decision rule lived. Another asked why an exception had been handled one way last quarter and another way this week. The answers were all there in notes, in logs, in comments I'd written for people who knew how to read them. But knowing where something isn't the same as knowing why it exists. And that gap kept widening. I wasn't asked to rejoin meetings. Not yet. Instead, people tried to reconstruct my thinking from artifacts. They pulled reports, highlighted lines, circled phrases like they might reveal intent if stared at long enough. They didn't, because the work wasn't mechanical. It never had been. Compliance isn't about rules. It's about judgment context built over years, understanding how a regulator thinks, how a client reacts, where risk actually lives when the numbers look clean but the pattern feels wrong. That kind of judgment doesn't survive translation. At some point, someone noticed something else. My name appeared on more things than expected. Templates, escalation notes, internal guidelines that had been standard practice for so long, no one remembered who wrote them. Entire sections of process documents traced back to decisions made quietly, long before Evan ever joined. That's when the tone changed. The questions stopped being how do we handle this case and became how did this become so centralized? Those questions don't point outward, they point up. I received an email marked confidential, short, direct, Chase. We're conducting an internal review of role dependencies. Your perspective would be valuable. Perspective, still not authority. I didn't respond immediately, not out of spite, out of clarity. I reread the retention offer. Same expectations, same restrictions, same number. Nothing had changed on their end. They were asking for context without offering correction. So I replied with one sentence. I'm open to discussing scope and responsibilities once alignment is established. The meeting was postponed. That told me everything. The company wasn't ready to talk about compensation. They were ready to talk about containment over the next few days. I watched the situation stabilize but not resolve. Issues were handled conservatively. Decisions took longer. Clients noticed the hesitation even when nothing went wrong. That's the cost of uncertainty. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Evan stopped calling, not because things were better, but because he'd learned something uncomfortable. Every question he asked led to another one he couldn't answer, and the more visible he became, the thinner his confidence sounded. This wasn't collapse. It was erosion. And once erosion starts, no one can pretend they didn't see it coming. If you watch until the end, you will understand what everyone else missed. Visibility changes people. Once Evan became the face of compliance, once every explanation, every reassurance, every uncomfortable question pointed in his direction, the job stopped feeling simple. Meetings stretched longer, emails multiplied. His language shifted from confident to careful. Careful sounds responsible. It also sounds unsure. I noticed it in the updates he sent. Longer paragraphs, more qualifiers, phrases like based on current understanding and pending further confirmation. None of it was wrong. It just wasn't decisive. Decisiveness is what executives pay for, or think they do. Clients began asking for second opinions. Not formally, nothing you could point to, but subtly. A follow-up here, a clarification there. The kind of questions that signal reduced trust without saying it outright. Northbridge responded the only way it knew how: more meetings, internal syncs, alignment calls, working groups formed to distribute expertise, documentation projects launched with aggressive timelines. People who had never worked a compliance incident from start to finish were suddenly assigned to rewrite procedures they'd never applied. It looked productive. It wasn't. The more visible the effort became, the more obvious the gap was. Knowledge can be shared, judgment takes time, and time was the one thing leadership didn't want to acknowledge they'd never invested in. Yeah, an email reached me from someone in finance I barely knew. We're trying to understand how certain risk thresholds were historically interpreted. Your past reports reference patterns that aren't defined elsewhere. They weren't asking how to fix anything. They were asking how to explain decisions already made, I replied politely, briefly. Those interpretations were situational. They weren't meant to be standardized without training. No follow-up came, because training costs money, and acknowledging it costs credibility. Meanwhile, Evan was everywhere, calls with clients, calls with leadership, calls with legal. His calendar became a patchwork of obligations that didn't leave room for actual work. He was being retained fully, just not supported. That's when I understood the irony. They hadn't rewarded him for knowing more. They'd rewarded him for appearing capable of handling pressure, and pressure has a way of exposing the difference. I didn't enjoy watching it. There was no satisfaction in it, just recognition. I'd lived in that pressure for years, quietly absorbing it so others wouldn't have to. Now it was visible. Northbridge didn't reach out again, not directly. They didn't want a conversation that might force them to admit the problem wasn't a person leaving. It was a decision made earlier, a number chosen casually, a hierarchy reinforced without reflection. The system wasn't failing. It was behaving exactly as designed. And designs always reveal their flaws eventually, especially when the person compensating for them stops doing it for free. The call came without ceremony. No subject line hinting at urgency. No assistant checking availability first. Just a direct request to talk, phrased carefully enough to sound optional. It wasn't when I joined. The tone was different from anything before it. Slower, measured. The kind of calm people use when they're trying not to reveal how much ground they've lost. They didn't start with Riverbend. They didn't start with Evan. They started with structure. Chase, one of the executives said, we're reassessing how we define critical roles. That phrase again, critical roles, as if the problem had been terminology all along. They spoke about resilience, about avoiding single points of failure, about distributing responsibility more evenly across teams. Everything was framed as forward-looking lessons learned, improvements underway. I listened without interrupting. Then came the pivot. We'd like your help transitioning some of that institutional knowledge, another voice added, to make sure we're not overly dependent on any one person. There it was. Not an apology, not acknowledgement, a request packaged as strategy. I responded calmly. I understand the concern, but that transition is work, and it reflects responsibilities beyond my current role. Silence followed. Not surprise calculation. They hadn't expected resistance. They'd expected cooperation, delivered out of habit. Someone cleared their throat. We're open to discussing adjustments, they said carefully. But we also need to be realistic about budget constraints. Budget. Always budget. I thought of the retention spreadsheet. 2 numbers, same role, different faces. I'm open to alignment, I replied. Compensation, scope, and authority, all 3. Another pause. This one lasted longer. They asked for time to review options. I agreed, and that was when the call truly shifted. Because for the first time, the conversation wasn't about convincing me to help. It was about whether they could afford not to over the next few days. The tone inside the company changed again. Less noise, fewer broad initiatives, more targeted questions, the kind that suggests someone has finally connected the dots. Evan's visibility faded, not publicly, quietly. His name appeared less in emails, fewer invitations, fewer requests for reassurance. He hadn't failed. He'd simply become associated with uncertainty. That's how organizations work. They don't punish directly. They reassign relevance. I wasn't invited back into daily operations. Not yet. But the silence around me felt different now, not dismissive, attentive. They were watching, measuring, recalculating for the first time. The system wasn't assuming my presence. It was considering my absence. And that changes the math faster than any argument ever could. Recalculation doesn't happen loudly. It happens in private calendars, quiet follow-ups, and documents that suddenly need one more revision. I could feel it in the pacing of messages, slower, more deliberate, less certainty, more care with language. That's when finance reached out again, not with questions this time, but with data. They wanted historical context, how certain risk thresholds had been treated over time, how often exceptions occurred, how many incidents never made it to leadership because they were resolved before escalation. On the surface, it looked like analysis. Underneath, it was exposure. Because once you quantify prevention, you also quantify reliance, I answered selectively. Enough to be accurate, not enough to be generous. Numbers have a way of doing the arguing for you if you let them. Patterns emerged quickly. A disproportionate number of high-risk cases resolved during my coverage window, fewer escalations, shorter resolution cycles, lower downstream costs. It wasn't flattering, it was factual. Facts are harder to dismiss than feelings. That same week, I noticed something else. The retention spreadsheet changed, not publicly, not announced, but quietly updated in the system. With new columns added: role complexity, decision autonomy, coverage risk. Metrics that hadn't existed before suddenly mattered. Evan's number didn't change. Mine did. Not officially, not yet. But the conversations around it did. HR followed up, careful not to frame it as negotiation. We're revisiting how we assess criticality. They wrote, there may be an opportunity to revisit alignment. Alignment, still their favorite word. I replied with a single sentence. I'm open to alignment that reflects responsibility, not availability. That line traveled farther than I expected. Meetings shifted, smaller groups, fewer voices. People who rarely spoke before started asking sharper questions, not about Riverbend, not about documentation, but about continuity. Who can decide this? Who understands the edge cases? What happens if that judgment isn't available? Those questions don't lead to quick fixes. They lead to budgets, and budgets lead to accountability. By the end of the week, the conversation had narrowed. No more broad initiatives, no more vague improvement plans. Just a single thread. What does it actually cost to replace judgment? The answer, inconveniently, was more than $35,000. Evan didn't call. I didn't expect him to. His role hadn't changed, only the perception around it. Visibility had done its work. And now, the system was correcting itself the only way it knows how. Quietly, slowly, reluctantly. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. Because this was never about getting more money. It was about ending a pattern, one where competence was assumed, absorbed, and discounted until it disappeared. And now that it had, Northbridge was finally learning how expensive silence can be. The offer didn't arrive with urgency. That's how I knew it wasn't confident. It came wrapped in neutral language, careful phrasing, and a subject line that suggested collaboration rather than correction. By the time I opened it, the outcome had already been decided somewhere higher than the inbox. They wanted to talk numbers, not in comparison to Evans, not explicitly. Just a revised figure, framed as a realignment rather than a reversal, a larger bonus, expanded scope, a title adjustment that sounded meaningful without changing much at all. Still no apology. That part stood out. Organizations apologize when they miscalculate facts. They don't apologize when they misjudge people. In their mind. This wasn't a mistake, it was a delayed optimization. The revised number was closer to fair, not perfect, but close enough to tempt someone who still believed loyalty could be restored retroactively. I read it twice, then I noticed the rest. Same retention period, same repayment clause, same expectation of availability unwritten, but unmistakable. They wanted judgment on demand, but still didn't want to acknowledge ownership. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't about keeping me. It was about restoring the illusion that they could, if I accepted. The story would be simple. Northbridge corrects course, leadership listens, the system works. No one would need to examine how long the imbalance had existed or why it took risk exposure to notice it. If I declined, the story would be harder, messier, full of questions no one wanted asked. I replied with a short note. I appreciate the update. I've accepted another opportunity that better aligns with how I work and how I'm valued. That was it. No counter, no explanation, just truth. The response came quickly, too quickly. They asked if I'd reconsider, if there was room to discuss a transition plan, if I could stay on temporarily to ensure continuity. Continuity, the word they always reached for when they meant dependency. I declined again, politely, cleanly, by the end of the day. My access was scheduled for revocation, not immediate, orderly, professional. They wanted the exit to look mutual, even if it wasn't. I watched the internal chatter slow after that, not because problems were solved, but because everyone understood the shape of the loss now. Evan sent one last message, short, awkward. Guess things worked out for you. I didn't respond, not out of resentment, but because the truth was quieter than that. Things hadn't worked out. They had simply reached their natural conclusion. Northbridge didn't collapse. Companies rarely do. They adapted, carefully, expensively, with more caution than confidence, and I moved on without needing to explain myself ever again. The first week at the new job felt unfamiliar in the best way. No early morning tension, no quiet dread before opening a dashboard. The work was still complex, still required judgment, but this time, it was shared. Questions didn't feel like traps. Decisions didn't feel like liabilities waiting to be blamed on someone invisible. For the first time in years, my calendar had space. Northbridge didn't disappear from my thoughts right away. Habits linger longer than jobs. Still woke up early for a while, expecting alerts that never came. But slowly, the quiet stopped feeling strange and started feeling earned. I heard updates through the industry, the way you always do. Northbridge hired consultants, reworked their compliance structure, introduced layered reviews where instinct used to live. Costs went up, timelines stretched, nothing catastrophic, just heavier, slower, more expensive than it needed to be. Evan stayed. He fulfilled his retention period. From what I heard, he worked harder than ever, not because he wanted to, but because the system now expected from him what it had quietly taken from me for years. That wasn't revenge. It was gravity. The truth I carried forward wasn't about bonuses or titles. It was simpler than that. If an organization only notices your value when you step back, it was never paying for it in the first place. It was borrowing, assuming you'd keep showing up, keep absorbing pressure, keep making things disappear without asking what that cost you. Walking away at 5 o'clock wasn't dramatic. It was precise. It taught me that loyalty without alignment is just endurance, and endurance isn't a strategy. It's a warning sign. Now, when I log off, I do it without hesitation. And when my phone is quiet, I let it be. Because knowing when to leave isn't failure. Sometimes. It's the first decision that's finally yours. I want to pause here for a moment, not to explain what happened, but to sit inside it with you. Because this story was never really about money. It was about that quiet moment when you realize you've been carrying more weight than anyone ever acknowledged, and you've done it for so long that it started to feel normal. I remember sitting there after everything slowed down, feeling strangely empty and clear at the same time, like stepping out of a noisy room and realizing how tired your ears actually were. If you're still listening right now, I'm glad you stayed. It tells me this story touched something real for you too. Do yourself one small favor when this ends. Place both feet flat on the floor and notice the chair supporting your back for 10 seconds. No fixing anything. Just let your body register that it's being held. Sometimes that's enough to reset more than we expect. What this experience taught me, what I hope it offers you, is this: your value isn't proven by how much you endure in silence. It's revealed by the moment you stop explaining your worth to people who benefit from not understanding it. Walking away didn't make me stronger overnight, but it gave me back something quieter and more human: self-respect without noise. Are you listening from somewhere familiar or somewhere new today? Let me know. I read the comments more than you think. If this story reminded you of a moment you've lived through, share it. Someone else may need to hear they're not alone. A like or a subscription isn't just support for the channel, it's a signal that these stories matter. And if you stay with me, there are more moments like this ahead, honest ones, human ones, the kind that linger long after the screen goes dark.